Greetings. You are on Ruslan Belov's channel, and this is another daily overview of the situation on the Ukrainian front. Be honest, doesn't the year 2026 strike you as extraordinary? The sheer number of events, their intensity, nature and scale truly give one pause. It would seem that Donald Trump has come to power in the United States, actively presenting himself as a peacemaker, a politician who does not start wars, but rather ends them. Yet increasingly, there is a growing sense that it is precisely during his presidency that the likelihood of a new large-scale conflict is becoming especially high. I would be very interested to hear your opinion as well. How do you assess what is happening? What do you expect next from 2026? What events, in your view, may still occur? Be sure to share your thoughts and forecasts in the comments. Meanwhile, we move on to a detailed analysis of the situation along the line of contact. So friends, you have probably already noticed a recurring pattern. Every time the armed forces of Ukraine launch counterattacks on one section of the front, a serious collapse of their defenses begins somewhere else. Why does this happen? The reason is fairly straightforward. Ukrainian command continues to expend manpower without regard for losses, effectively sending soldiers to certain death. It is worth recalling that not long ago, it was precisely the Ukrainian side that regularly accused Russia of employing so-called meat assault tactics, claiming that such an approach was characteristic exclusively of the Russian army. However, as we can see, reality tells a very different story. A clear and recent example is the situation in the city of Rodinske. Formally, the settlement is under Russian control, yet the line of contact has not been pushed far enough away from the city's outskirts. This gives the Ukrainian armed forces the opportunity to periodically attempt incursions and local attacks. But the question arises, do they use this opportunity to genuinely retake positions? Essentially, no. Instead, what we observe are so-called media raids involving flags. Just recently, a group of Azov fighters, and here I ask you to pay close attention to an important detail. These were not territorial defense units, not regular infantry, and not random assault groups. These were representatives of what they themselves call the elite of the elite, fighters of the National Guard of Ukraine. This group entered Rodinske with a specific objective: to raise the Ukrainian flag, record a short video, and then declare an alleged restoration of control over the positions. In other words, to say, look, we are here, the flag is up, the territory has been retaken. I have already published the outcome of this operation on my Telegram channel. To be honest, I would like to show these images here as well, so that you could see with your own eyes how such PR stunts end. However, YouTube's rules do not allow the publication of such content. The footage is truly not for the faint-hearted, which is why I posted it in my group and will leave a link in the first comment under this video. It is precisely because of such, essentially suicidal attacks that the Ukrainian armed forces suffer serious failures on other parts of the front. This was the case during their offensive actions in Russia's Kursk region. If you remember, enormous resources were committed there, and the result was a large-scale collapse of defenses in Donbass. We are observing a similar picture now. For more than a month, Ukrainian forces have been conducting counterattacks on Kupiansk. The stated objectives were not achieved. The city was not retaken. Instead, in December, serious problems emerged on the Vovchansk axis, where the Ukrainian side lost the city of Vovchansk itself, along with 4 additional settlements. The situation then began to deteriorate rapidly in January on the left bank of the Oskil River. We previously analyzed in detail the Russian entry into Kurilivka, followed by advances into Podoli. Over the past day, new information has emerged indicating further progress. In Podoli, Russian fighters have taken control of the entire southwestern part of the village. In effect, only a small northern section remains under Ukrainian control, directly adjacent to Kupiansk. If this area is cleared, and personally I have very little doubt that it will be, Ukrainian units holding positions in Petropavlivka and Kucherivka will find themselves fully encircled, with no realistic chance of breaking out. Even now, their situation is extremely difficult. The width of the possible withdrawal corridor is less than 2.5 kilometers. In theory, a breakout is still possible, provided there is active support from drone operators. However, judging by current trends, this opportunity will soon be completely closed, and the entire section of the front will be fully cleared. It is also worth noting that after taking the southwestern part of Podoli, Russian units have moved right up to one of the most important settlements in this sector, the urban-type settlement of Kupiansk-Uzlovyi. To put this into perspective, before the war around 9,000 people lived there. Today it represents a heavily fortified defensive hub of the Ukrainian armed forces, from which forces are also transferred to the right bank of the Oskil River. From current positions, the distance to the first residential buildings is approximately 500 meters. Nevertheless, before launching an assault on Kupiansk-Uzlovyi, the Russian army must definitively resolve the issue of Kurilivka. Applying pressure to such a powerful defensive node from only one direction will not yield the desired result. The situation would be entirely different if pressure were applied simultaneously from both Podoli and Kurilivka. In that case, Ukrainian forces would face extremely serious difficulties. At the same time, Russian aviation has already begun striking another fortified Ukrainian position on the left bank of the Oskil, Kovsharivka. For example, just yesterday, a FAB aerial bomb struck the 3rd residential district, destroying a temporary deployment point of Ukrainian units. Overall, as you can see, in January the initiative on the Kupiansk axis has definitively shifted to the Russian army. In December, contrary to many expectations, Russian troops managed to hold the right bank part of Kupiansk and the city center, despite extremely intense assaults by Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian losses were substantial, their forces were significantly weakened, while Russian command redeployed additional reserves to the area. As a result, we are now witnessing counteroffensive actions carried out by Russia. The strategic objective, which we discussed in an episode devoted to plans for 2026, remains unchanged: the complete elimination of the Ukrainian bridgehead on the left bank of the Oskil River, from Kupiansk to Lozova. We now move to the Pokrovsk direction. Here, fierce meeting engagements continue along the Novopodhorodne-Novo-Mykolaiivka line. The Russian army is advancing north of Udakne. Russian units have reached the Matyushina Gully near the road to Serhivka and have engaged in fighting for the settlement. In Hryshyn, the front line remains unchanged for now. The Ukrainian side has ceased counterattacks, but continues to actively strike Russian positions with drones and mortars. In response, Russian artillery is systematically targeting fortified dugouts and trenches of Ukrainian forces in forested areas along the railway from Rodinske toward Dorozhny. These defensive positions significantly slow the advance of Russian troops south of Belitska. Further up the front, Ivanivka remains in the grey zone, as does roughly half of Dorozhny. The Russian army has closed the pocket east of Vilna and continues to develop its offensive north of Shakov in the direction of Kucheriv Yar. From Sofiivka, Russian units have advanced approximately 1.5 kilometers along the road toward Novopavlivka. Additional successes have been recorded south of Torska and north of Rusin Yar. The Kostiantinivka direction. Here, Russian forces are carrying out a broad envelopment of Kostiantinivka. South of the city, all forest belts around the Kleban Beek reservoir have come under Russian control. Assault operations continue in Ilinivka, Berestok, and Novodmitrivka, while further advances have been noted west of Chervone. We now move on to the Zaporizhia direction. In this sector, Russian forces have expanded their zone of control beyond the Haicha River in the areas of the settlements of Sviatopetrivka and Zelane. The clearing operation in Pryluki is nearing completion. Ukrainian armed forces reserves were struck in the area of Verkhnaya Tesa. Near Zhelezno-Dorozhne, Ukrainian engineering works were disrupted. Further up the front line, ongoing meeting engagements continue for strongpoints and high ground north of Ivanivka. Russian units have managed to occupy at least part of the northern section of the Bayraki Botanical Reserve and have also entrenched themselves at a nearby strongpoint. This creates conditions for establishing fire control over Ukrainian supply routes into Pryluki and opens the possibility of advancing toward a major fortified area west of Varvarivka. Control over this node is necessary to form the southern face of the defensive perimeter of the bridgehead on the left bank of the Haicha River and to prevent potential counterattacks from the adjacent forested areas. In the longer term, Russian forces will be able to push further west from here toward the railway section between Ternuvate and Zheleznodorozhne, creating the prerequisites for further expanding the semi-encirclement of the Ukrainian grouping west of Huliaipol. The Ukrainian armed forces garrison in Novopavlivka has been blockaded. Russian units have taken the high ground on the western outskirts of the settlement, reaching the road toward Ivanivka, expanded their control zone to the south, and cut off the exit toward Mezhova in the north. Moving on, over the past day, another settlement has been taken under control. This occurred in the Zaporizhia region, within the area of responsibility of the Dnipro grouping. Russian fighters succeeded in driving Ukrainian units out of the village of Bilohirya. However, frankly speaking, I do not expect any large-scale or breakthrough developments from the Dnipro grouping in this sector for now. The main events on the Orikhiv axis, in the area of the city of Orikhiv, will begin when forces of the East grouping approach from the east. Movement in that direction has already begun, and once they arrive, this entire sector will be effectively closed. For the time being, the task of Russian units here is to keep Ukrainian forces under constant pressure. The capture of Bilohirya is certainly a positive development, but it does not yet affect the overall situation on the Orikhiv sector. This area is extremely difficult. Ukrainian defensive structures on the southern axis were built even before the start of the full-scale conflict, and the terrain is literally saturated with concrete fortifications and engineering obstacles that have only been reinforced over the years. As a result, despite prolonged and intense fighting, breaking through the defenses here is extremely challenging. Returning to Bilohirya, the success is local and does not change the strategic picture. As we have noted repeatedly, decisive developments will begin when the East grouping, bypassing the main fortified areas, reaches Orikhiv itself. What else can be added? Yesterday, information emerged on the Zaporizhia direction indicating that Russian units had finally pressed through the village of Primorske, a long, extended settlement located along the former Kakhovka reservoir. Most of it had already been under Russian control, with only the northern outskirts remaining in Ukrainian hands. According to incoming reports, the village has now come under full and uncontested Russian control. However, at present there is no objective control footage, so this area has not yet been marked on the map. We are awaiting confirmation materials. Once visual evidence appears, cartographers will make the corresponding updates. Nevertheless, given the configuration of the front line, this report appears quite plausible. Under such circumstances, Ukrainian forces were unlikely to hold the northern part of the village for long. In addition, this development poses a potential threat to strategic crossings over the Dnipro River. It is important to understand that north of Primorske, beyond the small Konka River, lies the settlement of Malokaterynivka, which seamlessly transitions into the urban-type settlement of Kushuhum, and then further into Balabin. Balabin, in turn, has long since effectively merged with the southern outskirts of Zaporizhia. This is continuous residential development. Given Kiev's severe shortage of manpower, this direction could become extremely problematic for the Ukrainian armed forces. Moreover, the full extent of this problem is likely to manifest itself as early as spring. Holding Orikhiv, and later Zaporizhia itself, will become increasingly difficult for the Ukrainian side. Overall, this concludes today's overview of the situation on the front. We now move on to an analysis of the political situation. Russian telegram channels are reporting the so-called combat debut of the Geran 5, a new Russian missile. In terms of its layout and mission profile, it is essentially a light-class cruise missile belonging to a conditionally budget category. The missile is approximately 6 meters long, with a wingspan of about 5.5 meters. Its stated range reaches up to 1,000 kilometers. According to Ukrainian sources, the missile will be produced in 2 variants in terms of warhead weight, approximately 450 kilograms and around 850 kilograms. This range clearly indicates that its primary mode of employment is intended to be air-launched, although a ground-based launch option is not excluded. Su-25 attack aircraft, known by the nickname Grach, are capable of carrying up to 4 Geran 5 missiles, or up to 8 missiles of the previous version, the Geran 4. The aircraft does not need to transport them over long distances. Its task is simply to lift the missiles into the air and serve as a launch platform. As a result, crews can carry a minimal fuel load and the maximum possible number of missiles, which is fully justified given the extremely low cost per flight hour of the Su-25. This combination forms a convenient and highly effective strike system, especially for conducting mass strikes against the enemy's rear infrastructure using new, relatively inexpensive cruise missiles. Meanwhile, an increasingly tense atmosphere is forming around Iran. Donald Trump has stated that the United States is ready to help Iran on its path to freedom. Few doubt that Trump is indeed ready to help, just as Israel is also ready to do so. However, both Washington and Tel Aviv would prefer that Iranians accomplish this on their own. Judging by current developments, this does not appear possible without external involvement, as Russian analysts and bloggers have noted. In essence, so-called judgment days are approaching for Iran. Moreover, the current situation is largely a consequence of Tehran's strategic defeat in Syria about a year ago. Everything happening today is merely part of a single chain aimed at the final dismantling of the Ayatollah's regime. And if the United States and Israel fail to achieve this outcome right now, they will attempt to do so regardless before the end of Trump's presidential term. For Israel, this is perceived as a historic opportunity to conclude more than 40 years of confrontation with a complete and final victory. It is also worth addressing Europe's intense reaction to the issue of Greenland. A natural question arises: where does this hysteria come from, and what does Kosovo's independence have to do with it at all? Observing the helpless emotional outbursts of European politicians regarding the future of Greenland, which Donald Trump, for now verbally, is boldly, firmly, and unapologetically writing into the American sphere of influence, inevitably brings to mind the year 2008. It was then that many of the very European countries, now expressing outrage, first openly disregarded international law by supporting the recognition of so-called independence for Kosovo. In doing so, they helped the United States impose a precedent on the world, one whose consequences they had been repeatedly warned about. At the time, however, none of them imagined that this same logic would eventually be applied against them. Notably, Denmark also recognized that move, supporting a blatant violation of international norms to which it now itself appeals. Moreover, Denmark became one of the most active supporters of Ukraine, and for this reason, some observers believe it now risks being the first to lose part of its territory. The irony of the situation surrounding Greenland is that, among all NATO countries, Copenhagen, relative to the size of its economy, provided the greatest assistance to Kiev. Denmark transferred 19 F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, all 19 French-made Caesar 155mm self-propelled artillery systems previously ordered for its own army, around 100 tanks, dozens of armored personnel carriers, as well as many billions of euros for the purchase of ammunition and the direct support of the Zelensky government. All of this, according to European media, was done allegedly to prevent an invasion of Europe. Today, however, the situation appears ironic and even grotesque. The threat of an incursion onto Denmark's own territory now seems only a matter of time. The source of that threat, however, turned out to be entirely different from what was expected. And, as Trump sarcastically remarked, Copenhagen can oppose this with little more than a couple of dog sleds. Meanwhile, Europe's military arsenals have been severely depleted by the war in Ukraine, a war that, setting aside political rhetoric, Europe did not truly need. The United States, on the other hand, needed it very much. And now Washington, taking advantage of the weakened state of European countries, is effectively beginning a redistribution of territories in its own favor. What can one say? Bravo, Trump. This is exactly how he deals with those he considers naive or powerless.